Hey guys, we are live. My name is Candice Malcolm with the True North Initiative. Thank you so much for watching this Tuesday afternoon or evening, depending on where in the world you are. There's a lot going on in the news today, as typical, as usual, I guess, but it's December. You expect things to slow down a bit for Christmas, but not for us. There is a lot of chatter and a lot of talk right now about the situation in Alberta, this sort of new political realization or just this frustration that's bursting at the seams, and it's like everywhere you look you hear respectable people talking about separation. Lawrence Solomon had a really solid piece in the National Post over the weekend talking about the economic argument behind Western separatism or Alberta separatism. Danielle Smith and Brett Wilson had a really interesting conversation on the radio in Calgary about the topic, and going back to 1905 and discussions at the time of creating an independent republic of Alberta and Saskatchewan that would be called Buffalo. And more and more places that you look, you hear people talking about this. It's quite something. It's almost like no one wants to break apart Canada, and the subject was taboo for so long. You would never hear mainstream respected people in the business community, writers, politicians talking about this stuff, and suddenly here it is out in the open. And I think it's just so much frustration over Eastern Canada, Western, Central Canada, the attitude out of Quebec. We learned that Alberta will not qualify for equalization payments this year, despite constantly paying in. They're in the middle of an economic crisis and a recession, and yet Quebec is still receiving money. They're going to get about $1.5 billion this year. Alberta's not going to get anything. And to add insult to injury, Quebec's premier said that there's no social appetite for Alberta oil in Quebec, and that they don't want any of it. They don't want anything to do with it. Quebec is okay with importing blood oil from Saudi Arabia. They're okay with using oil. They're okay with having refineries. They just don't want anything to do with Canadian oil, which is quite the slap in the face, considering that Quebec has taken over $200 billion from equalization. So they're more than happy to spend money from oil. They're more than happy to spend the money on social services that are above and beyond what any other Canadian gets, based on oil revenues that get transferred mostly from Western Canada and Alberta to Quebec, but they don't want the pipelines. And so, something's got to give. And on top of that, you've got Justin Trudeau, who openly talks about wanting to phase out the Canadian oil industry. He's helped landlock Alberta. He's given them no options. And, it's interesting times in Alberta. And I have a column myself out in the Toronto Sun today. I tweeted that link out. I'll share it as well. And talking just about the frustration in Alberta and this sort of back and forth that's going on. That's not what I want to talk about today. Just wanted to talk about that issue right off the bat. The main thing that's happening in the world, I think, well, there's a couple of other things. Omar Khadr, as you might have seen, is now applying for a travel permit. He wants to go to Saudi Arabia to visit his crazy terrorist family. This is the guy that got $1.5 million from the Canadian government. And part of the reason he was set free and he was given this apology and all this stuff was that he swore he was nothing like his family, who were all terrorists. Remember, his father was the top-ranking al-Qaeda official that helped bankroll Osama bin Laden and 9/11. And, the whole family was basically brainwashed into this terrorist lifestyle. Well, Khadr promised that he was totally different and wanted nothing to do with his family. And now he's saying that he wants to go to Saudi Arabia to visit them. So that's pretty terrifying. And knowing Canada and knowing our bleeding heart system, he'll probably be able to go with his fresh new payment of $1.5 million in his bank account. What could possibly go wrong? Also, not what I wanted to talk about today. The main thing I want to talk about is that this UN migrant compact is now signed. It is now a thing. Canada has signed it. And I want to talk about, I know I've been focusing a lot on this topic, but I think that there's still just, issues that are not clear. I've noticed just tons of criticism in the media towards myself, towards anyone who's taken a very public position against this. Conservative leader in Canada, Andrew Scheer, said that the Conservatives opposed this idea, and they opposed the UN Compact, and one of the reasons was because it would undermine Canadian sovereignty. And when he made that argument, the liberals and the media just lost their minds and started calling him a liar, saying that this was a myth that was pushed by the far right in Europe and the alt-right in the United States. Alt-right is another term for white supremacist, racist neo-Nazis. So that's nice, getting called alt-right by the Liberal Party itself. Couldn't be further from the truth. So I wanted to talk exactly about how this compact undermines Canadian sovereignty. And then one of the other criticisms that I've had, I've made a claim that the compact blurs the distinction between a migrant and a refugee. In fact, that's what the entire point of this document is. If you read it, that's what it's doing. It's trying to blur the lines, trying to create a new class for migrants that basically mirrors the class that we have for refugees. So I'm going to go over those two things, and I'm going to explain exactly how this undermines our sovereignty and exactly how this blurs the distinction between refugees and migrants. Okay, so in the preamble itself, the preamble of this global compact, which was signed today, let me note that a lot of countries didn't sign it. And initially a lot of the media reports were saying that only the US was not going to sign it. When they first wrote this thing in July, the US was the only country that didn't want any part of it right from the get-go. They said no. So a lot of the media stories in Canada were just sort of echoing that without doing any update research on the conversations that have been happening around the world over the last 6 months or 5 months. And so they said, oh, it's only the US that's not signing this. It's not true. Scores of countries all over Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Israel. We're not only talking about countries that are supposedly run by right-wing populist governments. Switzerland's not signing it. Denmark had concerns about signing it. New Zealand, Australia. We're not just talking about countries that are run by so-called far-right strongmen. There was a pretty broad consensus around the Western world that countries didn't want to sign this. And then it was interesting, after I started pointing this out and others started pointing this out, I saw another media story and said, oh, well, 85% of countries in the world are signing this UN compact. It's like, who cares what 85% of countries? There's 160 some odd countries in the UN. Most of them are just horrible garbage dictatorships that have nothing to do with Canada. So why would I care whether those countries are signing the compact? I want to know whether other Western countries, other democracies, other liberal democracies like Canada are signing it. And when you look into that, you realize, a lot of Canada's closest allies and most similar countries to us, like the United States, like Australia, those are the people who pulled out. So anyways, let's get to the content here. So this is the compact here, and in the preamble, this is a point that I raised over and over again. Number 4, so, this is the stated purpose of this declaration, of this whole compact. And right here it says, refugees and migrants are entitled to the same universal human rights and fundamental freedoms, which must be respected, protected, and fulfilled at all times. And so that's why I said, this document seeks to make migration a basic universal human right. And that's why it's problematic. Someone criticized me, someone writing in the National Post criticized me, because the very next line in the compact says, however, migrants and refugees are distinct groups governed by separate legal frameworks. Only refugees are entitled to the specific international protection as defined by international refugee law. So they were saying Candice was just talking about how migrants and refugees have the same fundamental human rights, and she didn't include this part that says, hey, there's 2 separate categories. So there's a category called refugees, and they have their own set of laws that govern how they work and how countries have to treat them. And then there's migrants, and they have a separate framework. Saying that I didn't include that. Okay, well, let's go to the next line after that. So the very next line says, this global compact refers to migrants and presents a cooperative framework addressing migration in all its dimensions. Did you get that? So the whole point of this UN compact is to create a new framework that governs migrants. So we already have a framework that governs how countries have to treat refugees, and I'll get to that later in this talk. But this compact has to do with creating a new framework for how we treat migrants. And then if you go through the actual objectives that they have their 23 objectives that are here, and then each one has a long detailed explanation of what it does. If you read those objectives and what they're doing, they're basically enshrining the same framework that we already have for refugees and applying that to migrants. So a lot of the exceptions to the rules that we have for refugees, they're trying to make that framework for migrants. Okay, so that's the whole thing. Like right now, and this is how this new compact undermines Canadian sovereignty. So right now, Canada sets its own immigration rules. It sets its own immigration rules. I've worked in the immigration department. We have our own plan that we write every single year. Canada writes out a plan. They table it before Parliament. It's based on, you know, all these widespread consultations, and Canada decides, the Canadian government decides, this is how many people are going to enter Canada this year. This is how many are going to enter next year, the following year, and then they keep track of how many people left before. So there are 3 types of categories for immigration. There's the economic class, there's family reunification class, and then there are refugees. And so economic class is if you get a job in Canada, you get a visa, you get to bring your entire family. So say, you know, a dad of a family gets a job working in Canada, he gets a visa for himself, a visa for his wife and his 3 kids. Those are 5 visas. Those are all under the economic class. We have a separate class as family reunification. That's for extended family, or that's for Canadians who marry someone who is foreign and then they can sponsor them to come into Canada. The 3rd class is our refugee class, which is, there's 2 different categories within that. So there's the government-sponsored programs where we work with the United Nations and get referred refugees and bring those over through the government. And then we also have our private programs, so you can privately sponsor refugees through your church, through a charity, or through any individual group. They come together and you bring the refugee in. So that's our legal framework. That's how you can legally come to Canada. But then because we have a special framework for refugees, refugees don't have to follow that guideline necessarily. If you are a refugee, and there's a couple of UN treaties that outline this, there's the 1951 Refugee Convention, and then there's the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. So those are 2 different international agreements that we've signed in the past that say refugees get to be treated separately. Essentially, refugees don't have to follow a country's immigration rules. Like if you are a refugee, you want to come to Canada, you don't have to apply and come legally through one of those 3 streams. There's literally there's a law that allows you. So say you're a refugee, all you have to do is step foot on Canadian soil, throw your hands in the air, present yourself to a Canadian agent, a Canadian official at an airport or at a port of entry or at any immigration office where there's a Canadian federal immigration official. And you just put your hands in the air and say, I'm a refugee. And then because Canada's signed on to these treaties, because we've ratified these treaties in 1951 and the 1967 one, we Canadians don't have a say as to whether this person gets to stay in our country or not. We have to treat their case as if it's real. So that's how refugees already have a legal exception to our immigration rules. As long as they say they're a refugee, we have to treat their case as if there's merit to it. So then they apply, they get to put forth their application, they get to appear before a judge, they get all kinds of rights. They basically, the entire Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies to that person because they say that they are a refugee. And now the judge could find that, hey, this person's lying, hey, this person is not an actual refugee, they're not who they say they are, and we can reject their case, at which point we can try to deport them. But basically, as long as you say you're a refugee, you can break Canadian law, not only break our immigration law by applying outside that legal system that I explained, but also, you know, we overlook the fact that you might have crossed the border illegally to get into Canada. You might have used a fake or falsified passport to get into Canada. We kind of look the other way and say, it's okay that you broke the law because you are here and you're claiming to be a refugee, we have to treat you like a refugee. Oh, and also because it's Canada, they get access to all kinds of gold-plated welfare. They get welfare and specifically healthcare programs above and beyond what Canadians receive. And so this is already a way in which the UN has undermined Canadian sovereignty, because Canada doesn't get to say, well, wait a minute, you're not a refugee, like get out of here. No, you don't get to stay. We don't get to say like, oh, wait a minute, you know, there's all these red flags on your file, you have to go. No, we have to treat these people as if their case is legitimate. And so that undermines our sovereignty, that undermines our ability to set our own immigration system. Now, what this UN, and that's existing, that's thanks to those old treaties. And when I worked in government, it was a frustration because, you know, a lot of times you have people who come to Canada that are clearly not refugees. I'll give you an example. When I was working in government in 2012, the #1 source country of people filing asylum claims, if you had to guess, what would you guess? You'd probably guess maybe it would be Mexico or China, some country that has like a really brutal human rights record, right? No, the #1 source country of people coming to Canada and filing asylum claims at the time was Romania, a European country. And so, you know, there's just obvious scams. There's obvious, you know, human smuggling rings and groups of people who take advantage of Canada's generosity and are signing of these previous UN declarations. And so the point is that this new one, this 2018 Migrant Compact, seeks to create that same kind of framework and apply it to all migrants. So not people who fit a very specific legal definition of a refugee, which is someone who is fleeing war or who faces a well-found persecution, a well-found fear of persecution from the government based on their race or their religion or their creed. So instead of only a small group of people getting these exceptions and getting this special treatment from the government, well, they want to apply those same exceptions and those same rules and the same entitlements to everyone, essentially. And that's what the document itself lays out when those 23 objectives that, you know, it talks about. Yeah, sure, some of the stuff is not terrible. It talks about how we should track, you know, do a better job of tracking, you know, with census data to like see how these migrants are doing in the future. We should make sure that everyone has legal identification, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's some stuff in here that's not completely terrible, but, you know, if you look at the outline of what it's talking about, the various steps and pathways and, you know, entitlements and making sure that they have access to the same things and that they get to sponsor their family members over the same way, it's taking all the tenets of the special status that we give to refugees, where we allow them to break our law, and trying to apply that to a broad group of people, which basically just says, okay, it's no longer just a small group of people who claim to be refugees who get to have an exception to Canadian law, and they operate outside. So every year when Canada tables this immigration plan saying, we're going to let in 330,000 people into the country this year, these asylum seekers don't count in those numbers, they're separate. And the Trudeau government repeats that to say, oh, you know, these asylum seekers aren't jumping the queue, they're not coming to the front of the line, because no matter what, we're still going to welcome in our 330 as we stated. But these people just come in addition. So, you know, it's still an additional cost to taxpayers. It's still an additional burden on our agencies and on, you know, people who work with refugees, not to mention, you know, the welfare state and lack of housing and healthcare and education and all this kind of stuff that is impacted. And so, you know, that's how this framework could impact. And so then the argument they'll make is, oh, well, it's not binding. It's not legally binding. It's not like a treaty that gets ratified and then it becomes Canadian law. Well, no, that's not true. But the whole idea behind having this international document that Canada has signed is that it will be used and it will be referenced in Canadian courts. So say there is an individual who is a migrant. They're not a refugee. They're just a migrant. They're a person who came from, let's just take a country, Honduras, who wasn't necessarily fleeing persecution or war. They just wanted a better economic outcome in Canada. And so they get to follow the same guideline. Say they apply for refugee status and their case gets rejected. Well, they can appeal that. And in the appeals case, they can point to the UN Migration Compact that shows how migrants get all the same access and special privileges and treatment, and how, you know, Canada has to take their case seriously. That the UN Compact could be quoted, could be mentioned, could be used in that court case, and the judge could rule in favor of letting this individual stay in the country. So that would be a very specific example of how the UN document will be used to undermine Canadian sovereignty, because the Canadian government is saying, we want this person out of the country. They look to the UN document, they use that, a judge overturns it, and they get to stay in our country against the will of the government, against the will of the people. And, you know, it's so interesting because, again, Andrew Scheer got called a far-right racist, essentially, for saying that this agreement undermines Canadian sovereignty. But that's basically the argument that all the countries are pulling out have been making. This is from an Australian paper about Minister Dutton, who's their Minister of Home Affairs, which is sort of the equivalent of the Minister of Public Safety in Canada, or the Department of Homeland Security in the US. And here it says, Dutton says Australia won't surrender our sovereignty by signing the United Nations deal. And interestingly, I mean, they were making this argument back in July. That story came out in July. So as soon as this document surfaced, the Australian government was like, absolutely no way. And yet in Canada, we didn't even really start to have this conversation until like a few weeks ago. I mean, I know that there was that petition going around, and Maxime Bernier, the People's Party, had been the sponsor. I think I first saw that about a month ago, but Canada really didn't have a full discussion. We didn't have a public debate on this like they were having in other countries. And I think that's such a disservice. As soon as we start to raise the issue, myself, a couple of other columnists in the country, and then politicians, you had Michelle Rumpel, Maxime Bernier, and Andrew Scheer, three kind of heavyweights, all criticizing this agreement. And they were completely written off. Like all the media stories that I saw, all the headlines across the spectrum, if there is even a spectrum in Canadian media, but you had Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, National Post, iPolitics, CTV, Global, all of them repeating the exact same thing. Experts say this is not binding. Experts say this won't undermine Canadian sovereignty. Experts say this won't blur the line between migrants and refugees. It's like, we're not allowed to have a discussion about it. They just tell us what our opinion has to be, and they expect us to move on. And then you get the bullying and the name calling from Trudeau's sort of top inner circle, the immigration minister himself, Trudeau's top aide, Gerald Butts, and Trudeau himself saying that, if you oppose this, you're just peddling conspiracy theories. Basically, he said that Scheer was taking his talking points from Rebel Media. Well, actually, Rebel Media has done a pretty good job of covering this. Ezra Levant did a whole hour last week where he went point by point through the document and discussed his concerns with each one. Ezra's a lawyer. He understands these documents, and he really spelt it out. And I think that the points that he raised individually going through the text talks to the same kind of thing that I am, that the document is written to provide all of these special treatment, all the special privileges for migrants, not refugees, but for migrants. And that's the concern. It's such a shame in Canada that we did not get to have a public debate about this. We didn't have a conversation. We weren't really consulted. It was just kind of like, hey, this is happening. Canada's so excited about it. Look at this leadership role we're playing. And then anyone who disagrees is written off as a racist or a far-right figure. And I think that's sad. I think it shows that, the situation in Canada was we don't really have the ability to have a public debate. We're not allowed to have intellectual conversations. We're not allowed to debate ideas without fear of just getting called all kinds of horrible names by the top-ranking people in the country, either through the media or in politics. If you are critical of this, like I was, you get your name, smeared in the press. If you're Andrew Scheer, the leader of a political party, he's been hearing from Canadians all over the country with their concerns about this. He voices his concern, and he gets called, far right, alt right, yada yada yada, all the stuff that they always throw at you if you have any criticism of their dogma on immigration and diversity and multiculturalism. And so another thing I want to point out, which was interesting, so New Zealand, I'm not actually sure if New Zealand signed this document or not. The most recent thing that I saw was just reading like New Zealand newspapers from yesterday and today, and it was like everything was still unsure, that they're trying to delay their vote, and that they're not sure whether or not they're going to sign it. It's interesting, again, you look at the news down in New Zealand. This is from Radio NZ. The title says, Sovereignty Concerns Shroud NZ's Bid to Sign UN Migrant Pact. So, exactly the same kind of concerns about sovereignty, yet somehow if you say that in Canada, it's because you're just a horrible person. But basically the National Party in New Zealand opposed the compact, and this is what they said. They said that we don't need to be told by the UN what to do, and that this pact treats illegal and legal migrants the same. And so that's basically the point that I'm making, is that there's already a distinction carved out of our law to accommodate refugees, and this migration compact seeks to carve out an even greater hole from our immigration system for illegal people who come to Canada, crossing the border illegally at Roxham Road, entering illegally, people who show up with fake or falsified passports, and they just want to stay in Canada. Well, the Global Compact spells out all these things that they get, all these extra rights and all these extra privileges. And as I've noted before, the entire compact and this entire conversation, the major problem, the reason people hate this stuff and they oppose it, is because it doesn't recognize the rights or the sovereignty of the Canadian people. Everything in this document is about rights and privileges for migrants. Well, what about the rights and the privileges of Canadian citizens? What about our culture, our values? What about our communities? What's this going to do if Canada sends a signal that, hey, open illegal migration is now okay with us, and there's like a framework to accommodate it? What's this going to do to our cities, to our roads, to already heavily congested morning commutes or public transit? What about schools? What about housing, hospitals? Like, why doesn't it even acknowledge the problems that could exist? And this isn't getting into any of the problems when it comes to the Orwellian Objective 17, which I've gone into a lot in the past. You can check out some of my older videos on that, which is about how it wants to create basically it wants to sensitize and educate journalists. It wants to promote media outlets that have positive things to say about migrants, and then cut off and exclude outlets that perpetuate intolerance. Forget about all that creepy Orwellian language, which should disqualify the entire document to begin with. Even if we ignore the worst parts of it and we look at the substance of this compact and what it's supposed to be doing, well, it's still, incredibly terrible for Canada. And if you live in New Zealand, you can say that. If you live in Australia, you get to have a 4-month public debate about that and ultimately come to the conclusion that you don't want to sign this treaty. And if you live in the United States, it's like the opposite. The idea came up and they said, nope, the United States does not let the United Nations set its immigration policies. Immigration policies will be set by Congress. And that's sort of a bipartisan thing. Hillary Clinton, just as much as Donald Trump, agreed with that. And so it's not even a discussion whether or not they would join into this compact. Well, if you live in Canada, you don't get to have a conversation without having your name smeared by elites, and then you don't get to have any say, and the government's just going to sign it and sign away Canadian sovereignty, sign away our ability to kick people out of the country and say no to migrants who we don't want in our country, and we don't get to have any kind of a public say on that. So pretty disappointing. But I think that, rather than name call and smear and come out with this thing that if you don't like the United Nations Compact, it's because you're a conspiracy theorist, you're far right, you're alt-right, or you're racist, why don't you look at the substance of the complaints that people are making and address them in an honest way? Why can't we have an honest discussion and a debate in this country about our immigration system? And the fact that we can't do that, the fact that we get met with such scorn and mockery from elites, I think that that's part of the reason why Canada's approval rating on immigration has never been lower. Only 6% of Canadians want more immigration. And that's exactly what the Trudeau government is delivering. And so the more you tell people that they can't have an opinion about something, and then you tell them that if they do have an opinion, it's because they're racist, and then you turn around and you do exactly what the people don't want you to do. I mean, this is the reason why you have backlash. This is the reason why you have populist movements. This is the reason why there is anti-immigration sentiment across the Western world. It's because leaders don't listen to people. They don't let us have a conversation. They just talk down to us and sneer at us and then do whatever the hell they want anyway. And I think that that's a recipe for disaster. And if there ever becomes a big anti-migrant populist movement in Canada, Trudeau will have no one to blame but himself. It will be Trudeau's fault because Canadians, by and large, accept immigration. We understand that it's good for the economy, that it's good for, basically the welfare state to help reverse the massive hole that reckless governments of the past have created through unfunded liabilities. And we get that. And we say, okay, we'll let in immigration. We know that, all of our ancestors at some point migrated to Canada. And so Canadians are pretty open towards it compared to other similar countries, compared to if you look at public opinion in Australia or the UK or the US. Canada always had higher approval ratings. Well, that's plummeted. It's absolutely plummeted. Like I said, it's the lowest point since public opinion polls started happening in the country. And I really think that that's because of this attitude that persists among elites, among the Trudeau Liberals, among the media, this sort of consensus of elites that these people have, that you're not allowed to have an opinion on immigration and we're going to do whatever the hell we want regardless of what the people think. And again, if there is a backlash, it will be 100% because of Justin Trudeau and his policies. So I'm going to leave it at that today. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I encourage you to check out the True North Initiative. We've focused on immigration news. We've always got lots of content. We're putting out a new video every single day, so check that out. And if you like the work we do, if you want to support us, please consider joining one of the clubs. You can join for as little as $10 a month. You help support our entire operation, independent journalism in Canada, which is incredibly rare. And we've got a whole bunch of new things that we're going to announce in 2019, broadening the operation, doing more reports, bringing on more journalists, doing more videos. And I think it's a good cause because, Canada needs the other side of the story. We need the other side to be told, and it's not being told in the mainstream media. So check that out, truenorthinitiative.com. All right, everyone, have a great evening.